and welcome to Archive Dive. I'm Maria Lockwood, a reporter with the Superior Telegram. Each month, we dip into files on historic events, people, and places in Superior and Douglas County with local historians. Today's podcast will focus on the Grand Footpath, a trail that traverses from St. Croix Falls to Madeline Island. Known by many names over the years, it was used for travel by foot, on horseback, and via stagecoach as the area developed. Echoes of the footpath remain as various trails in Douglas County. Helping us dive into the story today is Brian Finstad, the historian with the Gordon Wascott Historical Society. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Thanks for swinging by. So, tell me about this Grand Footpath. What is the footprint of the footpath?
Sure. So really to understand the footpath, I'm going to jump back a little bit and talk about sort of the waterways and how people moved between the St. Croix Valley and Lake Superior.
Okay.
A lot of people are very familiar with the Brule-St. Croix portage, where the source of the Brule River and the source of the St. Croix River come from the same wetland. And from that wetland, the St. Croix flows south and the Brule flows north. And so by paddling up the St. Croix, portaging to the Brule, one can get from the lower St. Croix and, through the St. Croix, Mississippi, up to Lake Superior. And so that's pretty well known that people traveled that way. But what's lesser known is that portage had very limited utility. You couldn't use it in the winter. You couldn't use it when the water was too high. You couldn't use it when the water was too low. And getting out to Lake Superior, one could become windbound for days on the South Shore. Uh-huh. So Native people had a footpath that went from sort of the furthest navigable point on the St. Croix, which is kind of understood to be at the Fish Trap Rapids, which is just upstream from the CCC bridge on St. Croix Trail. Some people would know that. And that portage, it was called Women's Portage. There was a beginning point of the trail there, and it went from there basically up to Chequamegon Bay.
Okay.
And then as settlement came into the St. Croix Valley, and after the Treaty of 1837, the land was open for lumbering. More people kept coming up the St. Croix Valley, and they were cutting timber, and eventually sort of man-made trails or, European settler-made trails connected in with this footpath, creating that continual route that they could get from, points far to the south, such as Fort Snelling, St. Paul, all the way up to Madeline Island. And the reason Madeline Island was this primary destination point was it was really the earliest point of settlement for many, many people. It was a major settling place of the Ojibwe people. The early French fur traders settled there. The early English fur traders settled there. The American Fur Company was based there. So it was this major hub of activity. And what you have between St. Croix Falls and Madeline Island is this large stretch of sand that was deposited by glacial outwash. Okay. So it was frequently swept by wildfire. They believe on a frequency of, maybe every 5 to 10 years in a lot of areas. So it maintained this very open landscape, very similar to, if anyone's familiar with the Namakagon Barrens or the bird sanctuary between Gordon and Solon. It would have been this very wide open landscape.
Which would make it easy to travel across.
Exactly. So you have this perfect trajectory and you have this high, dry, and open land. Mm-hmm. And so they would go up the St. Croix to the Fish Trap Rapids where there was a point that made sense. And then from there, they would travel across to Chequamegon Bay. It forked off in different directions. One went to the foot of the bay near Boyd's Creek, and the other came out at the mouth of the Sioux River. So what happened is the very first early mail route was established in 1847. It was Route 4444 from the Falls of St. Croix to La Pointe on Madeline Island. Mm-hmm. And the earliest mail carriers were usually Métis men, men that had previously worked in the fur trade that typically had fur trade fathers and Ojibwe mothers. And they were used to carrying large, heavy packs, long distances in the fur trade. Mm-hmm. So it was a really obvious transferable skill when, by that point in time, the American Fur Company had gone bankrupt. And, these men that are great at carrying large, heavy packs, long distances, mail carrying kind of became a really logical next career opportunity. And you found this between Superior and Bayfield. You found this between St. Croix Falls and Bayfield, even up the North Shore. The early mail carriers were usually Métis men that, were somehow descended or maybe even themselves a part of fur trade society.
And they were carrying the mail on foot.
On foot.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's quite a distance.
Yeah, it really is. And you read these accounts too about, sometimes in the winter they took dog sleds, but it was dangerous work. They had to go long distances and, sometimes getting caught in snowstorms and blizzards. And so it began as a native footpath. Even in its footpath form, it was United States mail route. And then United States Senator from Minnesota, Henry Rice, established Bayfield more or less as a real estate development. And
Really?
Once Henry Rice established that, he really had a lot of motivation to connect it to St. Paul to get supplies and people coming up to Bayfield. St. Paul seems like a very distant point, but that would have been the closest major point of settlement. Around St. Croix Falls, Taylor's Falls, that was also a hub of a settlement there. Stillwater was sort of emerging at that time, but the lower St. Croix and heading down towards St. Paul, that was really where most settlement and supplies that he was trying to attract to Bayfield would have come from.
Okay.
So this footpath then began to just slowly get improved upon for wagon use. In 1857, they first improved it enough that it really then started to become called a road.
Okay.
The French had called it the Grand Footpath, but in French. And I wish I could say the name, but I don't speak French and I can't think of it. But it really went by many names. The early La Pointe is the village on Madeline Island. In the earliest times, it was called the Trail to La Pointe. And then after Bayfield was settled, it was largely called the Bayfield Trail.
Really?
If you were coming from the south, because you were heading towards Bayfield. So that was the trail you would take to Bayfield.
What if I was heading from Bayfield down?
Yep. And if you were heading from Bayfield down, they called it the St. Croix Trail.
Okay.
And that creates a lot of confusion because it's almost counterintuitive. A lot of people are aware that there were these two different names, but they think, by Bayfield, it was called the Bayfield Trail. And in the St. Croix region, it was called the St. Croix Trail. But it's actually the reverse because they called it by its utility, by what it was taking them to. So then in 1859, it first became improved enough for stagecoach use. And that was actually a really, really big deal, much bigger than you would think. Because in the terms of westward expansion, it was basically creating public transportation that linked Lake Superior to the Mississippi.
Oh.
So you'll find announcements in newspapers as far away as New York and Washington, D.C., announcing the first stagecoach that went across that trail.
Really?
Yeah. It's really amazing.
We were national news.
Yeah. And another interesting thing event in history was in 1863, all of the Ojibwe chiefs and headmen of the Lake Superior region convened at Madeline Island and sent a delegation to go meet with Abraham Lincoln. And so they convened at Madeline Island, and then they walked this trail all the way down to St. Paul, took a riverboat down to where the first railroad met the Mississippi, and then went east by rail to Washington, D.C. So there's areas where you can still see this trail in the woods. And it's kind of interesting when you find those imprints and just, you're just out there by yourself and you think, wow, all of these chiefs going to meet Abraham Lincoln walked across this spot. Or, just these two little ruts in the ground were so important that they made news back east.
Right, because the stagecoach could finally make it through.
Yeah. So then in 1863, it was really improved upon and became a line of the Minnesota Stage Company. And the Minnesota Stage Company put a lot of investment into building bridges and stopping places. So my hometown of Gordon was one of those stopping places on the trail. That's how Gordon was originally founded. And what's interesting about the 1863 improvements in the Minnesota Stage Company is there's a lot written about Wisconsin stagecoach history, but it never mentions this trail because it didn't connect into any Wisconsin stagecoach network of any kind. And there's a lot written about Minnesota stagecoach history, but they completely miss this because they're not looking for a Minnesota Stage Company line outside of Minnesota.
So because this was a hybrid line, it was in Wisconsin, but it connected to Minnesota.
Yeah.
It kind of got glossed over.
It gets missed. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the trail, it had many stopping points. Locally, Gordon was a major one. There was the one at the crossing of the Namakagon. There was one at Island Lake in Barnes, and then later that sort of migrated to Spider Lake near Iron River.
Okay.
And these stopping places, usually there was somebody who lived there, took care of travelers, but also might have, had a trading post or farmed, or as lumbermen came into the area, cut hay for the lumbermen. So they had these just kind of very varied, and also running post offices, and those people also carrying the mail. So they were really doing lots of different things. And again, trying to find, a new economic opportunity after the collapse of the fur trade.
Right. Now, parts of the Grand Footpath today are highway, right?
Yeah. Roads, more smaller town roads, but
okay, so not the main highways. They don't follow the footpath.
Yeah.
What are some of the roads people in Douglas County might be familiar with, or trails we might be familiar with that were part of this Grand Footpath?
The one that would most stand out to people would probably be Gordon's Main Street, is a segment of it.
Really?
And it doesn't follow, so our Main Street is also County Road Y. It doesn't follow Y on either end of town, but as Y goes through town, that's a part of the original trail system.
Okay, so downtown Gordon was right on the footpath.
Yep, our Main Street right in front of the Buckhorn. In fact, our Main Street is named Moccasin Avenue, and that's sort of an homage to the original footpath. If you go east of Gordon, there is a Bayfield Road, and that is, you can kind of tell where a lot of those roads are because they run at diagonals that seem to not make sense with the other grid of the roads surrounding them. So Bayfield Road runs at that diagonal because it's heading towards Madeline Island. If you go past Barnes, there's a Webster Road that follows it.
Okay.
The segment that came kind of from the higher country around the Makwa Barrens down towards the lake along the Sioux River is called Friendly Valley Road. And that almost perfectly follows it. And it's kind of neat that you can know exactly where it was because the early government surveyors marked it on their maps. So even where it doesn't exist, you can know where it was because of that in most areas. When I was a kid, you used to see lots of it. And it used to be sort of a fun little pastime of mine. I would go out and follow it. It crossed over our family's land, so I knew where it was.
Okay, so the Grand Footpath went right through your backyard, basically.
Yeah. And then you would follow it for a ways, and then inevitably you'd run into an area where some homesteader had farmed or some logging, company had furrowed for tree planting, and it would interrupt. But you would kind of know the direction it was going. And then you would just go around to the other side and you would find it again and follow it again. And it was sort of a really fun, sort of a fun pastime to do. Just over my lifetime, so much of it has disappeared just because more land gets developed, more land gets logged, and people don't know where it is. It's not anyone's fault, but it just disappears more and more.
There are some trails, though, that do still follow that path, at least for part of the way, right? Where could I go to get on that original path? Yeah.
So actually one of the best areas for seeing the actual historic imprints that are not disturbed is in the Namakagon Barrens.
Okay.
It followed across the Namakagon Barrens, and because that was designated as a wildlife area, there isn't logging, there isn't furrowing, and I mean, those should be there forever as long as the Namakagon Barrens exist. The Friends of the Namakagon Barrens group has done a really good job of bringing awareness to it. I believe in the last year or two, they put up some signage.
Oh, wonderful.
So that you know where it crosses the roads out there. You still have to kind of look for it. It's not as if it's an improved hiking trail, but if you know where it is and you get off the road, you can see the imprint, and it's kind of fun to follow it.
Excellent. Yeah. Are there some spots, so Main Street in Gordon, are there any spots on the trails in the Gordon, Solon Springs area that were part of this footpath?
Not designated hiking trails. I would love to create some.
Okay. Yeah. Wasn't there a group that was looking to create at least an auto tour or something where you could kind of follow along this path?
Thanks for the reminder. Yeah, so I've been involved with a project called the Northwest Sands Auto Trail, and it follows from St. Croix Falls up to Bayfield, and it uses modern roads that most closely approximate the trail. Okay. And of course, the segments that are the actual trail, if they're reasonably roadworthy, those are on the route as well. And then there's points of interest along the way that can tell you stories about the Northwest Sands ecological landscape that are either geological, historical, cultural, that sort of thing. And that project has been kind of an ongoing thing. It's been a collaboration with historical societies in the various different wildlife areas. It crosses over a lot of the Barrens habitat wildlife areas. It goes through the Makwa Barrens. It goes through the Namakagon Barrens. It does not go through the bird sanctuary, but about 2 miles off the edge of the bird sanctuary.
Okay.
It goes through a large part of Croix Meadows, and actually Croix Meadows at their visitor center has information about, in their museum area of their visitor center, it has information about a Smith's stopping place that was in their vicinity on what's now, their wildlife area property. And there's mentions of it. They have a timeline of the land that's now Croix Meadows, and there's mentions of it there. As it went down towards St. Croix Falls, it actually forked, just as it did at the Chequamegon Bay End. It kind of forked and went two different directions.
Because people were going not always all the way to St. Croix Falls.
It forked and went two different directions. The Stagecoach actually forked and crossed to Sunrise, Minnesota, and the Sunrise Ferry there. And then the other leg of it went towards St. Croix Falls along the east side of the river. And so Sunrise was a junction. And at Sunrise, there was the Point Douglas to Superior Military Road. Sunrise was the point where this trail intersected with that road.
Okay.
So those were the two earliest roads in the region.
Now, you said you had this project to maybe bring a tour or a map so people could follow this route. How far are you on that project, and can we see a map sometime soon? Is the tour?
Yeah. We did a lot of community engagement with different groups below Gordon. So not the lower St. Croix Valley, but lower end of the Auto Trail tour. And this coming year, we'd done the one at the Highland Town Hall, and that was actually 2 years ago now. And then all of our Bayfield County community engagement forums ended up getting canceled because there was a COVID spike later that fall. And then last year, there were just too many competing things going on that we couldn't pick
But
it
it
up
may
again.
be something that comes back into public view.
Yeah, we're having our next planning meeting next week, actually.
Okay.
So,
excellent. We'll keep watching for that.
yeah, I'm excited about that.
Why is it important to know this history? Why is it important for folks to realize this is the Grand Footpath?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's always interesting to me about how there were communities that were very historically connected together because of how people traveled that today we don't think of as very connected. So the Grand Footpath, St. Croix Trail, Bayfield Trail, Stagecoach Line fell out of use when the railroads came into the area. As soon as the railroads came in, it just very quickly disappeared. And even in the 1880s, you'll find they were already writing about it as if it was something from long ago history, which is interesting. And the railroads really reoriented everything in these north to south linear trajectories that don't follow the landscape. The native people were travel made sense following the open barrens.
Right.
But when the railroads came through and they could move dirt and create fill and, they could just make straight lines any way they wanted, they didn't have to follow what was naturally easy with the land. So the railroad lines really went north-south, east-west, and not on this diagonal that the Northwest Sands and the Grand Footpath had gone. And it really reoriented communities. And then our modern highways, if you think about Wisconsin 35, Wisconsin 53, Wisconsin 27, Wisconsin 63, they just are very north-south. And so now, Gordon would be aligned with communities like Minong, Solon, Hawthorne, Trigo, Spooner, because we're on the Highway 53 corridor. Whereas historically, Gordon was very connected with Stillwater, Bayfield, Grantsburg, Iron River on this diagonal axis. And so when you research Gordon history, it's just very interesting how there was a lot of people moving about in this axis and connections between all of these communities and just ties and connections that today you would find surprising. And actually, when you research Gordon history, you almost never find a mention of Minong or Solon. And here they're just, 10 miles away in either direction. But in the era of where this footpath and Stagecoach Line took precedent, you would much more likely find people from Bayfield or La Pointe on Madeline Island interacting with Gordon than in almost anywhere else, which is just it's surprising.
It is, very much.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
You bet.
And thank you for listening to Archive Dive. New episodes are available monthly at superiortelegram.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a topic you'd like us to explore, email me at mlockwood@superiortelegram.com.